Let me start with the reality of modern business. Your data probably doesn't stay in one country. The moment you use a global cloud provider or an overseas vendor, your data is crossing borders, often without you even thinking about it. Rule 15 is about governing those flows. In this chapter, we'll explore cross-border data transfers under the DPDP framework. We'll start with Section 16, which sets the foundation for the transfer rules and the notified country approach India has taken. We'll discuss the pending country list and what we actually know about it so far, because there's genuine uncertainty here. We'll work through mapping your own cross-border data flows because you can't govern what you haven't identified. We'll look at contractual safeguards with overseas processors and the way sectoral rules and data localization requirements can overlap with the DPDP framework. We'll talk about how to prepare before the country list is finalized, then walk through a transfer risk assessment as a worked example, and finish with a checklist. Cross-border rules are an area still taking shape, so we'll focus on what's known and how to prepare wisely amid the uncertainty. Let's begin. Let's begin with the foundation of cross-border rules, Section 16 of the Act, which sets up how India approaches the transfer of personal data outside the country. Here's the key concept to understand. Section 16 establishes that the central government may restrict the transfer of personal data to certain countries or territories. In other words, the government can specify where data can and can't flow. Now, this is actually a distinctive approach, and it's worth understanding how it differs from some other models you might know. In some frameworks, like the European one, the default leans toward restricting transfers unless specific conditions or approvals are met. India's approach, under Section 16, is often described as more of a blacklist orientation, meaning transfers are generally permitted except to countries or territories that the government specifically restricts. Let me make that distinction concrete. Think of two different club policies. One says, no one gets in unless they're on the approved guest list. The other says, everyone gets in except those on the banned list. Section 16's framework leans toward the second style. Transfers are broadly allowed unless a destination is specifically restricted. Here's why this matters for you. It shapes how you think about your transfers. Rather than needing pre-approval for every destination, the focus becomes knowing which destinations, if any, are restricted and ensuring you're not sending data somewhere you shouldn't. As we go through this chapter, keep this foundational framing in mind because it influences everything about how you plan and assess your cross-border flows. The starting posture is permission with specific restrictions, not blanket prohibition. Let's dig deeper into what we're calling the notified country approach, because understanding this mechanism is central to navigating cross-border transfers. Here's the core idea. The framework contemplates that the government will notify, meaning officially designate, countries or territories with particular status regarding data transfers. The government's notifications are what give the transfer rules their concrete shape. Let me explain why this approach was chosen and what it means practically. Rather than baking a fixed list of countries into the law itself, which would be rigid and quickly outdated, the framework leaves it to the government to designate destinations through notification. This gives flexibility. The government can adjust designations as geopolitical and data protection realities change over time. Think of it like a travel advisory system. The list of countries with advisories isn't frozen in the law. It's maintained and updated by the relevant authority as circumstances evolve. The notified country approach to data transfers works in a similar spirit, dynamic rather than static. Here's the practical reality this creates, and it's an honest one. Much depends on what the government actually notifies and when. The mechanism is established, but the specific designations bring it to life. Until those notifications are fully in place, there's an element of waiting and watching. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Understand that your cross-border compliance will hinge significantly on these government notifications. Your job is to stay alert to them, because a notification could change the status of a destination you rely on. The framework hands the government the pen, and you need to keep reading what they write. We'll talk next about the current state of that list and how to prepare amid the uncertainty. Let's address the honest reality of where things stand. the pending nature of the country list, and what we actually know versus what's still uncertain. Here's the situation, plainly stated. The framework establishes the mechanism for restricting or designating countries, but the detailed, finalized picture of exactly which countries fall into which category is something that continues to develop. There's a degree of watch this space here, and I'd rather be straight with you about that than pretend there's more certainty than exists. Why am I emphasizing the uncertainty rather than glossing over it? Because in compliance, pretending to know something you don't is dangerous. The responsible approach is to understand clearly what's settled and what's still pending and to plan accordingly. What we do know is the structure. The government holds the power to designate. The approach leans toward permitting transfers except where restricted, and notifications are the mechanism. What remains to be fully crystallized is the specific, comprehensive designation of destinations. Think of it like a building where the framework and blueprints are in place, but some rooms are still being finished. You can understand the structure and prepare even while certain details are pending completion. Here's the instructor's takeaway, and it's genuinely actionable. Don't freeze, waiting for perfect clarity. And don't assume the current ambiguity means you can ignore cross-border issues. Instead, prepare in a way that's robust to whatever gets notified. The organizations that handle this well are the ones that map their flows and build flexibility now, so that whatever the final list looks like, they can adapt quickly. We'll look at exactly how to do that next. Let's get into the single most practical thing you can do about cross-border transfers, regardless of how the country list shakes out: mapping your data flows. Here's the foundational truth. You cannot govern transfers you haven't identified. Many organizations genuinely don't know where their data goes, and that ignorance is the real risk. So mapping is about answering a deceptively simple question. Where does our personal data actually go? Let me show you why this is harder than it sounds. You might think our data is in our systems, simple. But then you realize your cloud provider stores it in data centers abroad. Your customer support tool is run by an overseas company. Your analytics, your email service, your backup provider, each might move data across borders. Suddenly, your data is in more places than you imagined. Think of it like tracking where the water from your tap actually comes from and goes to. You turn on the faucet without thinking, but trace the pipes and you discover a whole hidden network. Your data flows are that hidden network, and mapping reveals them. So how do you map? You inventory your data, identify every processor and service that touches it, and determine where, geographically, that data actually resides and travels. The result is a clear picture of your cross-border footprint. Here's the instructor's takeaway, and I can't stress this enough. Start mapping now, before the country list is even finalized. Because whatever the government notifies, your first question will be, are we sending data there? And you can only answer that if you've already mapped where your data goes. Mapping is the work that makes everything else possible. Let's talk about a practical tool for managing cross-border transfers responsibly: contractual safeguards with your overseas processors. Even within a framework that broadly permits transfers, you still bear responsibility for the data you send abroad, and contracts are a key way you manage that. Here's the principle, and it echoes what we discussed about processor security. When your data goes to an overseas processor, your responsibility for protecting it doesn't evaporate at the border. You've handed your data to someone in another country, and you need assurance they'll handle it properly. Contracts are how you secure that assurance. Think about it this way. If you lend something valuable to someone far away whom you can't easily supervise, you'd want a clear written agreement about how they'll care for it and return it. The greater the distance and the less direct oversight, the more those written terms matter. Overseas data transfers carry exactly that dynamic. So your contracts with overseas processors should bind them to appropriate protections, security measures, restrictions on how they use the data, obligations to assist with rights requests and erasure, and cooperation if something goes wrong. These contractual terms travel with your data, extending your protective requirements across the border. Here's a real-world reflection. Imagine a breach at an overseas processor who had no contractual security obligations to you. You'd have little recourse and a serious problem. Now imagine the same breach where strong contractual safeguards were in place. You have leverage, defined obligations, and a clearer path to manage it. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Treat contracts as a core part of your cross-border strategy. Wherever your data goes, let your protective requirements go with it, written down and binding. Let's address an important complication that catches organizations off guard. The DPDP framework isn't the only thing governing where your data can go. There are sectoral rules and data localization requirements that can overlap with it, and you need to navigate all of them together. Here's the key insight. In India, certain sectors have their own specific rules about data, including requirements that some data be stored or processed within the country. These existed before and operate alongside the DPDP framework. Let me give you the clearest example. In the financial sector, there are well-known requirements around keeping certain payment data within India. So even if the DPDP cross-border rules might broadly permit a transfer, a sector-specific localization rule could independently require that particular data stay onshore. Think of it like needing multiple permissions to do something. Imagine wanting to build on a piece of land. You might need clearance from one authority, but also separate clearance from another based on the specific zone. Satisfying one doesn't automatically satisfy the other. You need both. Data can work similarly, where DPDP rules and sectoral rules both apply. Here's why this matters practically and why it's easy to get wrong. An organization might focus only on the DPDP transfer rules and completely overlook a sectoral localization requirement that also binds them, leaving them non-compliant despite their best efforts on DPDP. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Don't view cross-border compliance through the DPDP lens alone. If you operate in a regulated sector like finance or handle data subject to localization, you must account for those overlapping requirements too. Map not just where your data goes, but all the rules that govern its movement. Compliance lives at the intersection of all of them. Let's tackle the question that's probably on your mind given all this uncertainty. What should you actually do right now before the country list is fully notified? Because waiting passively isn't a strategy. Here's the empowering truth. There's a great deal you can and should do now, regardless of what the final designations turn out to be. The uncertainty about the list is no excuse for inaction, because the most valuable preparation doesn't depend on knowing the list. Let me lay out the proactive moves. First, map your cross-border data flows thoroughly, as we discussed. This is foundational and entirely within your control today. Second, strengthen your contractual safeguards with overseas processors now so your protections are in place whatever happens. Third, account for sectoral and localization requirements that already apply to you. Fourth, build flexibility into your architecture so that if a destination becomes restricted, you could adapt, perhaps by being able to relocate or reroute certain data. Think of it like preparing for a weather forecast that isn't finalized. You don't know exactly what's coming, but you can still stock supplies, secure things that might blow away, and have a plan ready. Preparation makes you resilient to whatever actually arrives. Here's the instructor's takeaway, and it's the mindset I want you to carry. The smart organizations aren't sitting frozen, waiting for certainty. They're doing the work that pays off under any scenario: mapping, contracting, accounting for overlaps, and building adaptability. When the list is notified, they'll respond in days while others scramble for months. Use this period of uncertainty as preparation time, not paralysis. The work you do now is what positions you to comply smoothly later. Let's bring it together by walking through a transfer risk assessment, a practical exercise for evaluating your cross-border data situation. Picture a company called Global Shop that sells across multiple countries, and let's assess their transfers. We start by identifying the flows, drawing on the mapping we emphasized. Global Shop discovers their customer data goes to several places: a cloud provider with data centers abroad, an overseas customer support platform, and an international payment processor. Good. Now we can actually assess. For each flow, we ask a series of questions. Where exactly does this data go geographically? What kind of data is it and how sensitive? Is the destination one that's restricted or likely to be under the notified country approach? Do any sectoral or localization rules apply, for instance, to the payment data? Are there contractual safeguards in place with that processor? Let's see what surfaces. For the payment processor, GlobalShop realizes localization rules may require certain payment data to stay in India, a real issue to address. For the support platform abroad, they find their contract lacks clear data protection obligations, a gap to fix. For the cloud provider, the data is in a destination that currently seems fine, but they note they should watch for any future notification affecting it. See how the assessment turns vague worry into a concrete list of issues and actions? Now here's your exercise. Take your own organization. List your cross-border flows, then run each through these questions. Where does it go? How sensitive is it? What rules apply? And are safeguards in place? The gaps you uncover become your cross-border action plan. This assessment is how you convert uncertainty into manageable, prioritized work. Let's close out cross-border transfers with a checklist to guide your approach amid the evolving landscape. Start with understanding the framework. Do you grasp that the approach leans toward permitting transfers except to destinations the government specifically restricts through notification? Now the foundational work. Have you mapped your cross-border data flows thoroughly, identifying every processor and service that moves personal data outside India and where exactly it goes? This is the cornerstone, so be honest about whether it's truly complete. Check your contracts. Do your agreements with overseas processors include real, binding data protection obligations that travel with your data? Now the overlaps. Have you identified any sectoral rules or data localization requirements that apply to you independently of DPDP, particularly if you're in finance or another regulated sector? Move to preparedness. Have you built flexibility so that if a destination becomes restricted, you could adapt and reroute or relocate data? Are you actively monitoring for government notifications that could change a destination's status? And finally, the resilience test. If a country you currently transfer to were restricted tomorrow, how quickly could you respond? Run this checklist now during this period of uncertainty because the preparation it drives pays off under any outcome. Stay alert as the picture develops and revisit this as notifications emerge. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter where we explore significant data fiduciaries and the Data Protection Board itself.